Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Sure. I would like to thank everyone who made this meeting possible. It's an important subject, and I'm delighted to be here to be able to listen to the views of the participants and to share my views with you. I'm George Sadowski. I've worked in ICT for development in various capacities for about 40 years, including 13 years in this very building for the UN Statistical Office in DSA. And in that capacity, I was involved in the transfer of information and communication technologies to developing countries. In a true information society, one assumes that everyone has effective access to information and knows how to use it. When I worked at the UN, what I saw in country after country that I visited was what I came to call information poverty. Not having information, not knowing if the needed information exists, in fact, in some cases, not being able to conceptualize what information was required, and even if you know that it exists, not having any effective means to get it. This is a vicious spiral. The internet has the capability to reduce and almost eliminate this level of information poverty because it's a carrier for so much of the information in the world now that's useful, and it's a carrier also for the communication between people, individuals who need information and experts who have it. And this is really important if the Sustainable Development Goals are to be met successfully. Several of the presenters have talked about the digital divide, and it's an important concept. I see the digital divide as a layered concept. There are other dimensions to it. First, the internet and other ICTs have to be present. Then the users need devices to access it. The service has to be affordable. The user has to be able to use their own language and their own script. Local content is important for a lot of applications, not necessarily for all. International content is copious and sometimes is very, very useful for solving problems for developing countries. But there's one layer, the top layer of this, that I think represents a gap, and I'd like to present it to you. It's the culture of effective search and utilization of information, and that, I think, is something that hasn't been mentioned yet. Let me give you an example. I grew up in the United States, and when I was in elementary school, I was given a tour of the library and taught how to use something which I'm not sure you will recognize. It was called the card catalog. But it was very useful in terms of locating the information that I needed for whatever I needed it for. The card catalog is essentially gone. The internet and other digital resources have replaced it. In developing countries, there is, I think, what I noticed was a lack of understanding of how to use the information space that was available to these people. University libraries that I visited generally had at most 1,000 books, and the technical books were 20 years old. There wasn't a way to conceptualize how to get into the information stream, how to become current, and how to aggressively exploit the information that was being generated all over the world, rather than being a passive receptor of the information that happened to be available within arm's reach. We need to address this. I don't know how to do it, but I think the first step is to recognize that it may be a problem, and it may be a real problem if we're to reach many, many people, the majority of people in developing countries. There have been several comments about the multi-stakeholder model of governance, and it's an important model of governance that is fairly recent. You can identify it in a number of organizations, both in the technical sphere and outside the technical sphere. But I'd like to go back and talk about one of the major roots of multi-stakeholderism in the technical community. And I would argue that it's a product of the culture of the early internet. When the internet was started in 1969, by very few people, there was an almost immediate recognition among people that there was a lot of promise in this method of being able to access information and to communicate. And there was a lot of enthusiasm. Governments contributed, academia contributed, industry contributed, civil society was quite aware of it. In fact, civil society was one of the major forces in introducing pre-internet networks in developing countries, especially in Africa, and we should thank them for that. This culture that developed around the internet, this early NGO involvement, the power of sharing knowledge, the power of really pushing knowledge onto people, whether they wanted it or not. It was a very aggressive environment. It was a culture of enthusiastic assistance, and it had a commercial component, but the commercial component wasn't particularly large. I think that from this, the institutions that now administer the internet came forward. A group of cooperative distributed institutions working together, each having a function which makes the internet function. And I think what we got from that was an understanding that we could probably get maximum benefits from the internet by including all sectors and all stakeholders in the administration of the net, of the governance of the net, and in the addressing the many issues that the internet has as a pervasive technology has invaded all aspects of our society. Two other areas I'll close with, two challenges for continued focus on solving the gaps. One is that several people have mentioned that the ICTs are an essential cross-cutting technology for helping all aspects of the MGGs and the SDGs. It would be really helpful if the United Nations system were to emphasize that, if the discussions were to emphasize it, and that the United Nations would strengthen its ICT leadership. 15 years ago, there was a group, an ICT research and development group in UNDP. That's since been mainstreamed, and I think what's happened is that we have all assumed that since ICTs were available, that we no longer need to be concerned with how they are used. We just give people personal computers and maybe an internet connection and let them go about and do their business. I'm not sure that's correct, and I think that the cross-cutting technology would really benefit from more support, more central international support from the UN system. The second point I'd like to make, and the last one, is that surrounding ICTs and ICTs for development, there is an enormous amount of goodwill and talent in all of the stakeholder groups that are now participating in helping to use ICTs for social and economic development. And by including them in the discussions and the decision-making on an international level is probably the best way to ensure a rapid and effective response to the needs of developing countries in meeting their goals and realizing the opportunities that the technologies provide. Thank you, Madam Chairman.